The rain started at 9:14 p.m. over Ashgrove Memorial Hospital, and by the time it hit the ambulance bay windows in fat, slow drops, Maren Ellery had already clocked in, checked her badge twice out of habit, and taken her usual spot at the far end of the nurse's station, the one nobody else wanted because the chair wobbled. She was small, barely 5'3", with dark hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, and long sleeves rolled down to her wrists even in the middle of a Georgia summer. She moved like someone who had spent years learning how to take up as little space as possible. Nobody at Ashgrove knew her last name without checking her badge. Nobody knew where she came from. What they did know, what they said behind cupped hands at the coffee station, was that Maren Ellery was strange and quiet and probably not built for real trauma work. 22 minutes into her shift, the doors of Bay 3 exploded open, and a gurney rolled in carrying a construction worker whose chest had been split open by a fallen steel beam. And in the chaos that followed, nobody was watching Maren's hands, which was exactly how she liked it. But someone was about to notice. Because at 11:47 p.m., a call would come in that had nothing to do with the hospital directory, and everything to do with a name Maren Ellery had buried 8 years ago in a country she was never supposed to talk about. For now, though, it was just the beam patient, and the room was already losing him. The trauma bay smelled like antiseptic and wet copper, the particular tang of blood meeting saline under fluorescent light. Dr. Aldous Kane strode in like he owned the tile beneath his shoes, white coat pressed, jaw set in the expression he wore whenever he wanted everyone to know he was the smartest person in the room. Kane was the kind of doctor who introduced himself using his full title even to unconscious patients. He barked orders at the respiratory tech at the residence at anyone within reach, and completely ignored the small nurse standing near the head of the bed, watching the monitor with an expression too calm for the room she was standing in. The patient's oxygen was dropping fast, his lips going the color of old bruises, and the monitor let out a high, thin beep that meant his lung had started to collapse inside his chest, folding in on itself and slowly crushing his heart against his ribs. Doctors call this a tension pneumothorax, but all that matters is this. Without a needle in his chest in the next 30 seconds, he was going to die on that table. Kane was still shouting for imaging that would take 4 minutes they did not have. Maren stepped forward, quiet as a held breath, and said the 4 words that would define the entire night. She said she could feel it, not I think or maybe check. She said his lung had failed, and she said exactly which rib space needed the needle, and she said it in a voice so steady that for 1/2 of 1 second the entire room paused. Kane rolled his eyes at her the way you roll your eyes at a child who has wandered into the wrong classroom. He told her to fetch supplies. She did not argue. She simply moved, and in the 6 seconds it took Kane to finish barking at a resident, Maren had already pierced the 4th intercostal space with a hollow needle, releasing a hiss of trapped air, and the patient's oxygen numbers began climbing back from the edge of the cliff. The room exhaled. Kane took full credit within 30 seconds, telling the charge nurse he had called the decompression himself, and the charge nurse, a sharp-tongued woman named Denise Hollies who had never once bothered to learn Maren's first name correctly, nodded along like she'd seen the whole thing. Nobody looked at Maren. She stepped back into the shadow near the supply cart, checked the leftover pressure on the monitor one more time out of habit, not ego, and said nothing. This was not the first time credit had walked past her and shaken someone else's hand. It would not, she assumed, be the last. If you're already invested in Maren's story, go ahead and tap that like button right now, because it genuinely helps more people find these hidden medic stories, the ones about the quiet people who never ask to be seen. What nobody in that trauma bay knew, what not even Denise Hollies with her sharp tongue and sharper judgments could have guessed, was that 8 years earlier, in a valley whose name never appeared on any map handed to civilians, Maren Ellery had held pressure on wounds far worse than a construction accident while gunfire cracked overhead. And she had done it without flinching, without crying, without anyone telling her what to do, because there had been no one left to tell her. She had been combat medic Ellery then, attached to a special forces detachment doing work so classified that even her own mother believed she'd spent those years processing paperwork at a base in Germany. A special forces detachment, for anyone new and familiar, is a small team of highly trained soldiers who operate in dangerous places most people never hear about. And a combat medic is the person who keeps those soldiers alive when the nearest hospital is hours away by helicopter. Maren had done more surgery in dirt floor huts than most surgeons do in operating rooms with a full team and clean lighting. She had also, on one specific night that she never spoke about, treated a wound made by a very particular kind of explosive device. One with a signature spiral fragmentation pattern that only a handful of people in the entire United States military had ever been trained to identify on site. That detail matters, remember it, because it is about to walk back into her life wearing the shape of tonight's second patient. The rain kept coming, harder now, drumming against the ambulance bay glass in a rhythm that made the overnight staff jumpy without knowing why. Sound has a way of predicting trouble before anyone admits it out loud. At 11:02 p.m., the police scanner in the security office, usually a low hum of nothing, the drone dispatch chatter about a fender bender or a noise complaint, went suddenly completely silent. Not static silent. Deliberately silent, the kind of silence that happens when a channel gets cleared for something higher priority. Hospital Administrator Regina Voss, a woman who cared more about press coverage and donor relations than she cared about actual patients, wandered down to the ER floor in her blazer at nearly midnight, which never happened, and asked Denise Hollies in a hushed voice whether anyone had received the call. Denise had no idea what call she meant. Neither did anyone else. The overhead lights flickered once, the way old hospital wiring does during a storm, and somewhere above the building, faint but unmistakable, came the low chop of rotor blades cutting through rain. Stay with me here, because this next part is the moment the entire story has been building toward, and you do not want to miss a second of it. At 11:47 p.m. exactly, a military helicopter, dark green, unmarked except for a small tail number, dropped out of the storm clouds and set down hard on Ashgrove Memorial's helipad, rotor wash bending the security lights sideways and sending loose gurney blankets tumbling across the concrete like startled birds. Every nurse on shift crowded toward the ambulance bay windows to watch, hair whipping, hands cupped over their eyes against the wind and rain. Two figures in tactical gear ducked out from beneath the spinning blades, carrying a stretcher between them, moving with the flat, efficient urgency of people who had done this 100 times in worse weather than this. Behind them came a third man, older, broader through the shoulders, wearing the kind of quiet authority that told you immediately he was in charge, and he was already shouting a question into the wind before his boots hit the wet pavement. He was not asking for the ER doctor. He was not asking for the trauma team lead. He was asking by full name for Maren Ellery. Denise Hollies actually laughed out loud, a short, disbelieving bark, because surely this soldier had the wrong hospital, the wrong Maren, the wrong anything. Dr. Kane crossed his arms, already composing the sentence he planned to say to whoever was in charge, something about protocol and chain of command. And then the automatic doors slid open, and Maren Ellery walked toward the helipad without being told to, moving faster than anyone at Ashgrove had ever seen her move, and the older soldier's face changed the instant he saw her. He did not call her nurse. He did not call her ma'am. He called her commander, and something in his voice cracked with relief, like a man who had been driving through fog for hours and just saw the exit sign appear. If you're wondering what happens next, drop your guess in the comments right now, because I promise you the answer is not what you think. The patient on the stretcher was a soldier, mid-30s, with a jagged wound across his abdomen and thigh, blood soaking through a field dressing that had clearly been applied in a hurry, somewhere far from clean lighting and sterile trays. Maren did not hesitate. She snapped gloves onto her hands in one motion and began issuing orders in a tone none of her coworkers had ever heard from her. Calm but absolute. The kind of calm that comes from having given exactly this kind of order under exactly this kind of pressure 100 times before. She called for a specific clamp by its precise military medical name, then immediately translated it for the wide-eyed resident beside her, telling him plainly it was the tool that would stop the bleeding at its source instead of just slowing it down. She identified the wound pattern in less than 4 seconds. It was not shrapnel from an accident. It was fragmentation from a very specific type of explosive device, the same signature spiral pattern she had memorized 8 years ago. In that valley whose name never made it onto any civilian map, she looked up at the older soldier, the one who had called her commander, and asked him one question in a voice gone suddenly quiet. Was this the same unit? He nodded. He said they'd needed someone who actually knew what they were looking at, someone who had seen that exact signature before and lived to write the report on it. There was no one else in the country cleared and qualified who could be reached faster than she could. Take a second and hit that subscribe button if this story has its hooks in you, because there is a whole world of these quiet, hidden hero stories waiting for you, and I put out a new one every single week. Dr. Kane tried once to insert himself into the trauma bay, tried to reclaim some authority over a room that had clearly stopped being his the moment Maren Ellery walked back through those doors. He was met with a single look from the older soldier, a look that did not need words, and he stepped back against the wall next to Regina Voss and Denise Hollies, the three of them suddenly very small in a room they had spent months believing they controlled. Maren worked with both hands and a mind that had never really left that valley, clamping, packing, calling numbers off the monitor before it finished displaying them, moving through the golden window, that narrow stretch of minutes where a badly wounded person can still be saved if every single choice is the right one. The resident who had been handed the clamp watched her hands the way you watch a magician you know isn't using tricks. 68 seconds before the patient's heart rate would have crossed into the zone doctors dread most, Maren had the bleeding controlled, the airway secure, and the wound documented in a way that would matter later, to people far above Ashgrove Memorial's pay grade. When it was over, when the patient had stabilized enough to be flown onward to a facility built for exactly this kind of injury, the older soldier straightened to his full height in the middle of that trauma bay and did something none of the Ashgrove staff had ever seen happen inside those walls. He saluted her. A full formal salute, rainwater still dripping off his sleeve, in front of Dr. Kane, in front of Denise Hollies, in front of Regina Voss, who suddenly found her blazer collar very interesting to look at. He said in front of everyone that Commander Ellery had once pulled 4 of his men out of a collapsed position under fire, using nothing but her hands, her training, and a refusal to accept that any of them were allowed to die that night. He said the entire unit still talked about it. He said the word legend, and he did not say it lightly. Comment below with the moment in your own life when you underestimated someone quiet. Because I promise you, almost everyone reading this has a Maren Ellery they walked past without noticing. The full picture came out slowly over the following days, the way truth tends to when it has been buried on purpose for a long time. Maren Ellery had served as a Special Forces combat medic attached to a classified detachment operating in some of the most dangerous, least talked about corners of the world, earning a field commission and a reputation among operators as someone who simply did not lose people, not if there was any way at all to keep them breathing. She had left the service quietly, taken a civilian nursing license, and chosen Ashgrove Memorial specifically because it was ordinary, because it was the kind of place where nobody would ask questions, because after 8 years of being responsible for keeping soldiers alive in the worst conditions on Earth, she wanted nothing more than to disappear into the hum of an ordinary night shift. She had never once told anyone at that hospital what she used to be, not out of shame, out of discipline. The same discipline that had kept those 4 men alive under fire kept her mouth shut about her own history for 8 straight years. Even while people like Dr. Kane took credit for her instincts, and people like Denise Hollies mocked the wobbly chair she never bothered to ask to replace. Dr. Kane apologized to her the next morning, stiffly, awkwardly, in a hallway with too many witnesses for either of them to feel comfortable. Maren accepted it the way she accepted most things, with a small nod and no lingering resentment, because holding a grudge had never once helped her save a life, and saving lives was the only scoreboard she had ever cared about keeping. Regina Voss quietly authorized a maintenance request to fix the wobbly chair at the end of the nurse's station, a small, almost silly gesture that meant more to the staff who witnessed it than any formal apology could have. Denise Hollies started, slowly and imperfectly, learning to pronounce Maren's name correctly and to actually look at her when she spoke. Share this video with someone in your life who works quietly and never asks for the credit they deserve, because stories like this one exist for exactly that person. The moral of Maren Ellery's story is not complicated, even though her past was. Titles never saved anyone. Loud confidence in a white coat never stopped a single collapsed lung or closed a single wound. What saves people every single time in a war zone or a trauma bay or anywhere else life falls apart without warning is quiet practice skill, paired with the discipline to keep working even when nobody is watching and nobody is saying thank you. The most dangerous person in any room, the most capable, the most prepared, is very often the quietest one standing in it. The one with the wobbly chair nobody else wanted. The one whose name gets mispronounced for months before anyone bothers to get it right. So here is the question I want you to carry with you long after this video ends. How many quiet, capable people have walked through your own life unnoticed, doing extraordinary things while you were busy watching someone louder take the credit? How many Maren Ellerys have you underestimated, simply because they never once raised their voice to prove themselves to you? If this story moved you even a little, tap that like button so more people can discover these hidden medic stories, the quiet ones who turn out to have carried entire wars on their shoulders before anyone noticed. Subscribe if you want a brand new story like this one delivered every single week, because there are so many more Maren Ellerys still waiting to be told. Drop a comment below and tell me honestly, would you have noticed her before that helicopter landed, or would you have laughed along with everyone else? And when you're done here, the next video on your screen right now continues exactly this kind of story. Another quiet person the world underestimated until the truth finally, unmistakably, arrived. Before you go, take a second and hit subscribe, because these stories about the quietest people carrying the heaviest histories deserve to reach more ears than mine alone can give them. There is one more piece of this story worth sitting with, a detail that never made it into any official hospital record. Weeks later, long after the helicopter was gone and the rain had cleared and Ashgrove Memorial had returned to its usual rhythm of ordinary nights, a small package arrived for Maren Ellery at the nurse's station. No return address, no note beyond a single line of handwriting. It thanked her simply for once again being the reason someone got to go home to their family. Inside was a challenge coin, the kind soldiers exchange as a mark of respect that outranks any medal worn smooth at the edges from years in someone's pocket. Maren kept it in her scrub pocket after that, out of sight, exactly the way she had kept everything else about herself for 8 quiet years. not because she needed anyone to know it was there, but because some things are meant to be carried privately, and that more than any salute or apology was the truest reflection of who she had always been. If you want more of these stories, the ones about the overlooked people who turn out to be carrying entire histories nobody guessed at, stay close. Because the next one on your screen right now is waiting, and it might just be about someone you'd never have expected either.